Friends, I think we might make a start if you want to take a seat. Welcome to our online friends. Welcome to my former colleague Liz Tolkamp. Are you in the retirement phase yet, Liz? Are you in the retirement phase or are you still working?
I'm working part-time.
Cool. Awesome.
Semi-retired.
Semi-retired, yeah, cool. Good on you. Jonathan Bayliss, a long-time friend of Kinbrace and refugee advocacy here in Vancouver. And we have some people here in the room, really grateful. And then many people who'll be watching this after the event as we're videoing this evening. So what we're doing today is we're launching this wonderful new book called A Renewed Canadian Welcome, 11 Visions from Migrants and Advocates. And Emilio Rodriguez is the editor who's pulled it all together. A Renewed Canadian Welcome, 11 Visions from Migrants and Advocates, a distinctively Canadian book published by McGill Press. And this is my copy just here, and I'm so thrilled to have my copy. So we're going to be hearing from some of the authors from this book tonight. We're going to be hearing from local refugee advocates, and it's going to be a really good journey of a couple of hours. So welcome, everyone. And I just want to pause as we begin to acknowledge that even as we're talking about land and belonging and home and place, that we're gathering here on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, and more broadly the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people, who this is their land that's been untreated. So we just acknowledge that with honour and respect. And needless to say, when we're speaking about place, when we're speaking about land and belonging and welcome, that the colonial settler relations are a really important part of that. So we just want to acknowledge some of the people who are here in the room. Dana Nicolai will be hosting our panel in just a moment, and Dana works with the Christian Reformed Church and Refugee Advocacy and at First Christian Reformed Church, and we're neighbours. We live one block away from one another. And Tim DeCow, also my colleague here, who lives 5 blocks away from me, my colleague here at the Centre for Missional Leadership. We pass it together at Grandview Church. I want to also just welcome Lynn Weaver, who is one of our wonderful panellists today, and Malad Rajabi as well, who's one of our panellists, and Willard Metzger, who's very kindly walked all the way from Ottawa. No, he didn't walk all the way from Ottawa. He flew all the way from Ottawa, and Willard is the CEO, the ED of Citizens for Public Justice, who's the primary host for this event here at the Raucomers. Mabra and Peter, welcome. And so friends, my name is Mark Glanville. I'm the director of the Centre for Missional Leadership that's based here at St Andrews Hall. And we run programs and events, and we publish books that equip leaders in our Canadian post-Christian context, and indeed for many Western contexts. I have a book myself on refugee welcome called Refuge Reimagined, Biblical Kinship in Global Politics. And I invite you to check out our website, thecml.ca, which has a whole bunch of stuff, including some online filmed courses that we've produced. Well, now I'm going to hand it over to Willard, and Willard is just going to introduce us a bit to the Citizens for Public Justice and give us a bit of an overview for this book. Thanks, Willard.
Thank you all for being here. Appreciate your presence very much here on this gorgeous evening here in Vancouver, Burnaby. Citizens for Public Justice is an advocacy lobby charity that has been around for over 60 years, and we focus on 3 areas of domestic national policies, and that would be eradicating poverty in Canada, climate justice, and then refugee migrant rights, and that's what brings us here. So this is a book that has been in the making for a long time. When I started as executive director, one of my first hires was to hire our full-time policy analyst for refugee migrant rights, and that was Stephen Kaduli. This was right around COVID, And very sad to the staff team, to the CPJ family. Stephen died with COVID, and he died on the very day that he was supposed to be able to get his vaccine. So this was the very, very early days. And so that really was a tough one for us as a CPJ family. We held that post open for about a year, and then we hired Emilio Rodriguez, who put this book together. So he is the editor, worked hard at having some excellent authors, all of them excellent authors, 11 different chapters, and he has edited all together. He pitched it to McGill Queen's University Press, who said this is so good after it went through the first peer review. They said this should go through a second peer review, which ratchets it up, really. The academia will understand that more than I do. So, and that was a very successful second peer review as well, so that the book received an award to help with the publishing costs already before it was even in print. So this is an exceptional book that I know will become a textbook, I think, for universities across Canada, where, in fact, I'm doing a wedding. I'm still a clergy, doing a wedding in Germany, and we're just putting together perhaps something that can happen in Berlin, because there's some refugee work there being done, and with McGill connections. So this will become a universal book. There you go. This is incredible. So thank you so much. So this book is a labor of love by Emilio, and it is also in memory of Stephen Kaduli, our first hire and staff that we lost in COVID. And we are delighted to say that this is made possible also because of a matching grant that the chair at the time of CPJ offered, a $10,000 matching grant in honor of Stephen Kaduli. And now that this book is here, her and her partner Gary have put up another $20,000 matching grant that will go to refugee migrant rights works. And so we're just so delighted for the support, for the encouragement. There was some fear, I think, from the authors saying that, wow, in that second peer review, it was all delayed for a bit, right? And so you think, oh my, the things I've written 2 years ago or more, will they still be relevant now? But we've had a number of events, and what we hear over and over again is that this is so timely. So it is still incredibly relevant, and perhaps sad to say, even more timely than when the chapters were written. So that means there's work to be done. And so that's why we're so delighted to offer this as part of that conversation. What McGill really liked about it is that it elevates the voice of lived experience. And that is a new offer into the sphere, into the sector. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your concern, and for all those online as well. Appreciate your presence and your support. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Willard. I think for those in the room, maybe the microphone isn't working as much. Welcome. Please come on in. But for those online, I'm hoping that it's helpful for you to be able to hear. And we can see a few of you online, but I know that there's more people, because if you have your camera off, then we can't see you. But I saw that there were a number of people, and we've got more people joining us. Please welcome, come on in. So we know we're a small group this evening, but as Mark mentioned in his introduction, we're hoping to use some of what we're talking about tonight, different photos and videos of it, for ongoing conversations. So we're very grateful to all of you for being here. My name, as Mark mentioned, is Dina Nikolai, and Mark and I we are neighbors, but we haven't seen each other for a while, so Mark doesn't know that I have a different job now than what he introduced me as, so similar but different. So I am actually program associate with World Renew's Refugee Sponsorship and Resettlement Program. A number of people in the room are very familiar with World Renew. But World Renew is an international relief and humanitarian organization that's based in Canada and the United States. But in Canada, it also has a sponsorship agreement with the Canadian government. So it's a sponsorship agreement holder, and we're going to be talking more about that later, which means that we can work with groups across Canada to help those groups sponsor refugees. So with World Renew. Thanks, Mark. But I'm up here right now, though, to share a little bit more about the current landscape of what it looks like for refugee welcome in Canada. Before I say that, though, I just want to echo what Willard said, Willard's back there, about Stephen Cajuli. And I really loved opening the book for the first time and seeing the dedication to Stephen, because I had an opportunity to collaborate with Stephen on a few different things and meet him a couple times. I especially benefited a lot from the research that Stephen did, which is such a gift that CPJ has given to so many organizations involved with newcomers and refugees, is really robust research that shows us what's actually happening from a policy perspective and other ways. And Stephen was such a wonderful advocate. So it was very, actually, Mike and I, who you know, Steve, Willard, had to take over from Steve on a presentation shortly after he passed away. And it was a challenging thing to do, but we were so glad to carry that on in his memory. And so it's such a gift to see this book as well in his memory. I think that if Stephen were here today, he would agree with me that the current state of refugee welcome in Canada could probably be best described as a declining welcome. And some of you online may have heard me talk about this. I've used that phrase before because it really is in direct contrast to what we hope to talk about tonight, which would be a renewed welcome. And so there's three different areas that I'm going to highlight. Some of you are aware of these, but some of you are not. So there have been a number of cuts in a number of areas, as well as introductions of new bills. So the first thing that we are seeing this year and then the last year or so are cuts to humanitarian immigration levels and to refugee sponsorship spaces. So every fall, the Canadian government announces its permanent resident targets for the coming year and the years to come. So that's how many permanent residents it will admit. So those are, again, the levels targets. And within that, you see economic stream, family reunification, and you also see refugees and protected persons. And so what we saw for 2026 is a 16% reduction in the number of refugees and protected persons that Canada will admit as permanent residents in 2026. Within that 16% reduction, we saw a 30% reduction in the number of privately sponsored refugees that will arrive in Canada as permanent residents. And there's a number of you in the physical room and in the online room who are involved in the private sponsorship of refugees. And you are feeling these cuts acutely because what they mean for you is the refugees that you are waiting for, who you are sponsoring. You have submitted applications for them. You often have the money and the housing ready. And you are waiting now years and years for them to actually arrive in Canada. And that is because of those cuts to the numbers of refugees that will actually land here. And this isn't simply a matter of sponsors being ready. Even more importantly, these are all people who are waiting in very vulnerable situations. So for example, a number of groups that I'm working with have applications in process to sponsor Afghan refugees who are waiting in Pakistan. Pakistan is actively deporting Afghans in the millions back to very unsafe situations in Afghanistan. Some of these refugees that they are deporting actually have sponsors ready and waiting to welcome them in Canada. And so when the government cuts these numbers, those refugees are even at greater risk of being deported. And I can tell you that some of them are already living in awful conditions in Pakistan, in fear every day of being deported. So there's real human cost to these kinds of cuts. It's not just the numbers or targets. In addition, we are seeing a 54% reduction in the number of spaces for sponsorship that groups like World Renew have received in 2026. So what that means is we get approached every day by groups and by people in Canada asking us, can you work with us to sponsor someone that we know overseas, a friend, a family member, another contact? And we are having to say, no, we cannot, because we don't have enough spaces from the government. And we're going to have a bigger conversation about that later. But again, this is a real significant human cost to this, and we've had to have some very hard conversations. The second big thing that is happening in the Canadian landscape right now is the passing of Bill C-12, which was passed at the end of March. And it goes by names such as strengthening Canada's border, strengthening Canada's immigration system, but Bill C-12. There are a number of problematic aspects to this bill. There was a lot of advocacy done before it was passed in the hope that it would be amended. And unfortunately, it was passed sort of wholesale in its original form. Now, different groups were raising concerns about this. You heard the Conservative Party, for example, raising concerns about the way it allows the government to collect and use data. So there's some privacy concerns. From a refugee protection perspective, there's some significant concerns with how it does or does not allow people to make refugee claims in Canada as a refugee claimant, or what some people might call an asylum seeker. So most significantly is it introduced a 1-year bar, and I'll give an example of this, but a 1-year bar, meaning that if more than 1 year has passed since someone first entered Canada, they are not allowed to make a refugee claim. I'm going to give you 2 examples of what that means. So the first is, imagine that, I'm going to use Ukraine as an example. Imagine that 15 years ago, a couple and their young child came to Canada to visit relatives in Alberta. And they had a lovely holiday, and then they went back to Ukraine. Then, several years later, Russia invades Ukraine, war starts, and that person thinks, I would like to make a refugee claim. And I can't participate in the other program Canada has. So they come to Canada and they make a refugee claim. Well, because they came to Canada as a tourist 10 years before, they are not allowed to make a refugee claim anymore. That's one example. Second example is one that has been on the news a lot as a story, which was of a man from Gaza whose sister was living in Canada and needed a kidney. And her brother in Gaza was eligible to give her a kidney. This was before the war started in Gaza. And so he left his wife and his kids back in Gaza, he came to Canada, he gave his sister his kidney, he recovered, he went home to Gaza because he was going to stay in Gaza and his family was in Gaza. Sometime later, the war broke out in Gaza. So now he wants to get with his wife and his kids to Canada and make a refugee claim. He's no longer eligible to make a refugee claim because more than a year has passed since he first arrived to give his sister his kidney. So again, these are things that maybe on the surface people think, oh, well, that seems to make sense, a 1-year bar. The way it's presented seems reasonable. But when you look at the real human impacts, it does not acknowledge the very complicated situations that people seeking refuge are coming from. And the fact that global conflict is constantly changing. A country that was safe 1 year may not be safe the next year. I've talked to many Afghans who were very hopeful about remaining in Afghanistan before the Taliban came back. They thought, what an opportunity to be in our country, to rebuild our country, and we get to hear from someone later. And then the Taliban came back in. And all of a sudden, everything that that Afghans imagined for the future of their homeland has changed. So again, does not acknowledge that complexity. The other thing that Bill C-12 does is it gives the government power to cancel immigration statuses en masse. So they could, in theory, for example, say, we think that everybody from country X who has a student visa, we're just going to cancel them all. So if you're from country X and you have a student visa, we're not going to look into the nuances of your situation or look at your application at all. We're canceling it wholesale for whatever reason. That is power that we don't believe it is appropriate for a government to hold because it cannot be exercised well and with attention to the nuanced situation of individuals. So that's Bill C-12. And then the final thing that we are seeing, which just came into effect on May 1, are cuts to health care for refugees. So many refugees are covered for a short time or a longer period of time by something called the Interim Federal Health Program, or the IFHP program. And what we are seeing now is refugees are being asked to make co-payments on a number of services. Now, doctor's visits and hospital visits will still be covered by this, but additional services, supplemental coverage, including many prescriptions, will not be covered. One story that was shared with me this morning was of a young child with cerebral palsy who needs to take a number of different medications in order to treat her cerebral palsy. Now her parents are going to have to pay 30% of those costs, and because of their current situation, that is an extreme financial burden on them. So we are hearing, especially from medical professionals who work very closely with these populations, that this is a financial burden that many people cannot carry, with significant human consequences again. And then alongside those cuts, we are also seeing cuts to settlement services, such as English language classes. The government is saying, well, if our levels are lower, if not as many people are arriving, we don't need to fund as many English classes. But what we are seeing is it's actually people who are already here who cannot access English classes. It's people who are arriving who are on 8-month wait lists for English classes. I know a family from Syria who's been here for 4 months and very eager to be in classes. They were in a class for 3 months, and then it was canceled. And so now they have no access to English classes. And so again, significant human faces and stories behind these cuts. And so this is one of the reasons we're here tonight, because when the government makes a number of these cuts and they are asked why, one of the things they'll say is, well, this is what the Canadian public wants. Many of us believe this is actually not what the Canadian public as a group wants, because we hear many people saying, we had no idea, and if we knew, we would have said something, or we want to say something. So we want to raise awareness of this, but even more so, we believe with CPJ that what we really need is a renewed Canadian vision for welcome, a renewed vision for welcome in Canada, and then that could be a positive vision. So in the face of a declining welcome, that there's so much space for us to speak positively. Canada really has, in its history, so many good examples of upholding humanitarian commitments to people around the world. And I really could stand here and give you many positive examples of previous years. It's just not the current state of things. But we have been proud of that in the past, and I believe that we can continue to work for that, to uphold that. And so our next section, before we move into our panel with our guest speakers, is we are going to hear from Mark again, because we have a variety of people in the physical room and the online room from a variety of backgrounds, but a number of the organizations that are hosting tonight come from the Christian faith tradition, which we believe has many things to say about welcome. And so Mark is going to speak about that, and then we are going to hear from our guest speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana. It was really helpful, the way that you outlined the ways that this current government, unfortunately, has eroded Canada's welcome. I'm an immigrant from Australia, and Canada certainly had a shining reputation as a place that welcomed and enfolded refugees from across the Pacific Ocean. But yeah, under the current government, unfortunately, that has changed. So I think that the title of this book, A Renewed Canadian Welcome, is really timely, and it's my job in these few minutes now to go to the sacred and ancient Christian tradition and to look there for, if you like, the heart of God for people who are on the move and seeking a home. So I'm an Old Testament scholar, or a scholar of the Hebrew Bible. So I'd like to go to the Old Testament, if I may, and I'd like us to use our imagination, actually, and to try and imagine what it might be to be without a home in ancient times. And we're going to go back 2,500 years, maybe a little more. Many, many people were displaced. Can you hear me okay, Jonathan? Thank you for that. Is this okay, Jonathan?
It came back. It was garbled for a few seconds.
Got you. Cool, thank you. In ancient times, a family or individuals could be displaced because of warfare, especially, sometimes because of famine. So here is a make-believe story that's also a real story, because it would have been repeated tens of thousands of times. Well, it was repeated, we know that, in ancient times. This is from the time of the Old Testament. Imagine the circumstances of a family of 3 generations that has fled their own village because of war. In this case, nearly a millennia before Christ. Hebrew Bible times, Old Testament times. Jonathan and Abital, their children, and Abital's mother, all those from the family who miraculously survived the conflict, have struggled for miles along a hilly trail to find sanctuary. One circumstance is in their favor. The time when the kings go to war is also the time of the spring harvest, and they have some hope at least of finding a little food to eat. After seeking work in a number of settlements along their path, they came at last to one where Abital and her mother are invited to help with the herds that roam within the village walls. Is pretty well known. So this figure of Jonathan and Abital, a refugee, a person on the move seeking a home, appears 22 times in this one book in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, 22 times. And it shows us that forced displacement, that needing a home, was perhaps even the most pressing social issue in the time of the Old Testament. And I think it was. People seeking a home and slavery were the 2 issues that the Old Testament addresses more than any other social issue. So, what I'd like to do is to read a couple of sentences from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Deuteronomy in the Hebrew Bible, and it's the most famous couple of verses to do with refugee welcome, maybe in all of Christian scripture. So Deuteronomy 10, 18 and 19 reads like this. The Lord, or Yahweh, executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger or refugee, giving them food and clothing. Love the stranger, therefore, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That's a really packed 2 verses, so I'll read it again. But Yahweh, the God of ancient Israel, the God of the Old Testament, is saying this to God's ancient people. And I'll read it again. The Lord, God's saying me, the Lord executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger, refugee, giving them food and clothing. That's what God does. And then this is what you're to do. Love the stranger, therefore, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And if you remember the story of the Hebrew Bible, God's ancient people were enslaved in Egypt and then emancipated out of Egypt.
by a great act of Yahweh their God. And so God says, love the refugee, love the stranger therefore, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. And just as interesting background, they were refugees in the land of Egypt. You remember in the middle of Genesis. And then as refugees, God's ancient people were then enslaved. That movement from being a refugee population to being an enslaved population. So I'd actually like to, that verse that I've just read is quoted a lot in refugee advocacy. It's one of the most quoted. Love the stranger is one of the most quoted verses among Christian refugee advocates. So I thought, what if we kind of look at it and unpack it in all its wonderful detail? Because it's wonderful on a surface level, love the refugee, but actually if you understand what that means in its ancient context, it's way more incredible. And the key to it is that word love itself, where God says, love the refugee or love the stranger. And I wanted to show you what kind of work that word love does. First of all, that word love is used 3 times in Deuteronomy chapter 10, in this section of the Bible. It says that Yahweh, or God, has loved you. And this is ancient Israel, the people of the Hebrew Bible. Yahweh has loved you. And it says, Yahweh loves the refugee. Therefore, you are to love the refugee. And that's interesting in itself, because there's 3 kind of directions that love's flowing. Yahweh has loved you, God's ancient people. Yahweh loves people who are on the move seeking a home, refugee. Therefore, you are to love the refugee. And it's kind of beautiful. It's like, as those who have been beloved by God, you're to do what God does. Kind of respond in like as if you're looking at God in a mirror. Act like God. God loves the refugee, so you love the refugee. That's what you're to do if you're the people of God. God loves the refugee, so you do the same. And you've been loved by God, after all. So, of course you'll love the refugee. You've received that love, you'll now extend it. I love that, the 3 ways that love is flowing in Deuteronomy chapter 10. Yahweh loves God's people, Yahweh loves the refugee, therefore, of course, God's people are going to love the refugee. Love flows in that way, and it starts with God. And in a kind of image of God kind of correspondence, being like God, if God is good and God is good, we love the refugee too. Deuteronomy 10 is saying. That's good, but it gets even better. Because that word love is quite an incredible word. When we think of the word love in the West, of course, we might think of, well, the first thing we perhaps think of is kind of romantic love. Maybe, you know, kind of the love on a soap opera or whatever. A love in the falling in love. Maybe that's the first thing we think of when we think of love. So I want to explain what the word love, and in Hebrew, ahav is that word for love, ahav. And what that word means when it says Yahweh ahav the stranger, is so you are to ahav the refugee. The first thing you need to understand is that love, ahav, is taken actually not from romantic soap operas from ancient times. It's taken from the treaties between the great kings. And that's crazy. Like, you read the treaties between the great kings, and it's usually pretty ugly, like one of the great kings of the great empires, like Neo-Assyria or Neo-Babylon, has crushed, smashed, conquered another king. And then there's a treaty now between the great king and the vassal king. And the treaty says you must love Sennacherib, or you must love Nebuchadnezzar. Love is from the treaties of the great kings. And it's absolute loyalty. It means absolute unswerving loyalty. It's the language of international treaties, not of soap operas, not even of birthday cards or love letters. It's international treaties. And actually, in its ancient context, it's pretty ugly. It's saying you must love on pain of destruction. Love the great king, Nebuchadnezzar. Love the great king. So, when it says Yahweh has loved you, now it's kind of beautiful, because Yahweh is a great king, and it's saying this absolute loyalty that Yahweh has for Yahweh's people, this absolute loyalty that God has for the refugee, and this absolute steadfast loyalty that you must have for the refugee, for a person on the move who's seeking a home. It's quite incredible, the power of that word. There's no word in Canada like it. And I just wonder, going back to our imaginary people on the move, Jonathan and Abital and their family, how they would have felt if they had come into contact with that text. If they had been in ancient Israel and someone said to them, this is what the God around here is like. God loves refugees with a covenant love of steadfast loyalty. I think Jonathan and Abital would have been thrilled. And I think just personally that is so wonderful that God makes a covenant of steadfast loyalty with the refugee. You could put it another way. You could say a steadfast commitment of protection and love with displaced people seeking a home. And it's there in the Bible, Deuteronomy chapter 10. What a remarkable revelation of the character of God. What grace, you could say, to use a theological word. What tenderness. And God calls God's people to do the same, to have this same covenant commitment. So I'll just ask this room of refugee advocates, is this how you imagine God? As a God who makes a covenant with vulnerable immigrants? I think, just speaking personally, even as a Christian scholar, when I see the way that politically immigration and refugee welcome can be fraught with a lot of ugliness, I can forget that at the heart of reality is a God like this God with this heart. And how can this change our imagination for walking well in the world, for following God? And how can this open up our imagination even for politics? What a beautiful way of being in the world. Well, let me tell you what else this word does. So we've said that the word love, Yahweh loves the stranger, therefore you to love the stranger, is a covenant word from the treaties between the kings. It's something else as well. It's also a word for kinship. And in these ancient treaties that use the word ahav all the time, there's also a very strong metaphor of kinship. So the great king is the father of those that he makes a treaty with. And the kings are brothers. It's a familial family bond. And there's no doubt that the way that this word is used here and across the Hebrew Bible, that the word ahav, or love, has a really strong kinship flavor, kinship meaning. And so you could say it like this, that to enter a covenant is to enter a bond of family-like solidarity. And so when this word love is used for how Yahweh responds to people seeking a home, and when that word ahav, love, is used to describe how we are to respond to people seeking a home, it's really saying that the stranger, the refugee, is to be enfolded within the web of kin and covenant relationships, binding us together and binding us to God as well. And so this word ahav, you are to love the refugee. Yahweh loves the refugee. It's offering protection and belonging. It's so beautiful. And to take it back to its ancient context, it's saying that Jonathan and Abital, who were there providing cheap labor on the family farm at the peak of the harvest, when there's so much work to do on the farm, they're not to be treated as cheap labor. They're not just to be treated as agricultural workers to be sent home at the end of the season. They're to be enfolded as family. They're to be enfolded in this web of kinship and belonging. And that is so beautiful too. It's an image to me of bringing the weakest among us into the center of the community. When it says that Yahweh loves the refugee and the orphan and the widow, and so you have to love the refugee and the orphan and the widow. It's bringing the weakest into the center of the community. And it's moving from charity to kinship, to being a makeshift family. And that's so different because when we're a makeshift family together, we're all transformed. It's not just a one-way direction where the person who has land gives. But when you're family together, everyone is transformed and everyone learns. everyone has the opportunity to give and the opportunity to receive. Everyone has the opportunity to grow. And I love that many Canadian First Nations leaders use this idea of kinship and the web of kin relations between humanity and the creation, settlers and colonizers and First Nations people. Ray Aldred, one of our local First Nations leaders here in Vancouver, who teaches at Vancouver School of Theology across the road, he speaks of newcomers to Canada in that way, that we should all live like relatives. Well then, this word love, covenant and kinship. So returning to our imagined family on the move, Jonathan and Abital, returning to this ancient refugee family, Jonathan, Abital and their children and Abital's mother, they have found some work on this family farm. They have found a place to stay for the time being. What will be the outcome for this vulnerable family? At the end of the harvest, will they be discarded to roam the streets again? Well, if their hosts take God's word seriously, if their hosts take the Hebrew Bible seriously, which is their scriptures, the future actually looks promising. Because the book of Deuteronomy, it requires ancient Israelites to take kinship responsibility for these people, enfolding them in loving solidarity. Why? Because God loves these people with covenant solidarity, with kinship solidarity. So how can God's people do any less? Well, I love that passage, Deuteronomy 10, 18 and 19. And just to say that I'm a Christian, and so I'm a follower of Jesus. And when you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the Gospels, some New Testament scholars have said that Jesus literally eats his way through the Gospels. And when they say Jesus literally eats his way through the Gospels, they're referring to how many meals Jesus shares on the pages of the Gospels. Some scholars think that Jesus does more eating than he does teaching. He probably does much of, well, in fact, especially in Matthew's Gospel, he does much of his teaching while he's eating. And I used to think when I was younger that Jesus, in a sense, invented that. And it wouldn't be completely wrong to say he did. But it would be more accurate to say that Jesus was being what ancient Israel was always commanded to be. That Jesus was being like his God, like his Father, who loves the refugee and all those who are on the margins in first century Greco-Roman culture. Well, that's enough from me. But I think it is good for me and for my heart to anchor myself in sacred scripture and to remind myself of the heart of God. No matter what the politics are, at the heart of reality is a generous God. So I'm going to pass it back now to Dina, who has a fantastic job, and she's going to welcome our panelists.
Thank you so much, Mark. As Mark mentioned, I do have the best job of the evening because I get to interview our two great guest speakers. So I'm going to invite Lynn to join me up here. And I'm catching Milad. I'm going to invite Milad to join me up here. It's mostly connected to the online. We'll try and speak louder. We can talk loud. Yeah, but if you want to move up, please come up. Yeah, sorry, this mic is primarily for the benefit of the online audience, but I know it's a little echoey in here for those in the room. Sorry about that. We'll try and speak louder. So I am very grateful for our two guest speakers joining us today. This is really part of the heart of our conversation. And what I'm going to start by doing is I'm going to briefly introduce each of them, But then I'm also going to give them a chance to introduce themselves in their own words. So you're not just hearing that, because I'm going to read 2 brief bios of you, but then I want you to tell us the other things that you'd like us to know about you before we get into conversation. So our first speaker is Lynn Weaver, and Lynn is the co-author of the first chapter in the book, A Renewed Welcome. Lynn is a scholar practitioner in forced migration and gender equity. She's a recipient of the Lieutenant Governor's Award for Community Service, and she holds an MA in Global Leadership and is studying international human rights law. And Lynn lives on Vancouver Island. We're very glad to have you. And then Milad Rajabi is next to her. So Milad lives in Vancouver, and Milad is a refugee advocate, storyteller, and a community leader. He is the co-founder of Refugee Talk, a nonprofit and charity that works to uplift refugee voices and create spaces for refugees and newcomers to share their stories with dignity and purpose. Milad also works as a settlement coordinator at Kinbrace Community Society. Many of you in the room and online know Kinbrace well, so he works at Kinbrace, where he supports newcomers and refugees as they navigate settlement and belonging in Canada. And through his work in the community, as well as his participation in United Nations Connected Spaces and the Canadian Council for Refugees, he continues to advocate for justice, inclusion, and meaningful representation. He has also completed studies in forced migration at the University of Oxford and is currently pursuing graduate studies in social justice and human rights. So we have 2 very qualified people to speak with us today, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. But before we jump in, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Lynn a few questions, then I'm going to ask Milad a few questions, and then I have a few questions for both of them. And then we would love to hear questions from you in the room and you online as well. But first, Lynn, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you. Can you hear okay? Okay. And thank you for the warm welcome, and thanks to the organizers and especially Citizens for Public Justice and of course Emilio Rodriguez for pulling us all together. Before I sort of say what is my bio, I need to just clarify what isn't my bio, which is there was a little bit of miscommunication that went out online. I'm an affiliate with the Center for Migration Studies at UBC. I do not work at UBC. So just making that really clear. At the time of writing the chapter, I was leading the staff team at the Canadian Refugee Sponsorship Agreement Holders Association, very long name, known as the SAW Association. So that's the umbrella for all of the private refugee sponsorship in Canada that happens through organizations that have an agreement with the Canadian government to sponsor. And so who are those sponsors? As many of you know, it is a lot of faith-based groups. It's also a lot of diaspora community groups and other, settlement agencies or other community groups as well. So a very diverse community across Canada outside of Quebec. And I had the extreme honor of co-authoring the chapter with Kaylee Perez, who at the time was the chair of the elected SAW Council, and Aziz Oria, who was the program developer for the SAW Association.
Thank you. Milad, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you. 1 spoon of love, 2 spoons of kindness, 3 tablespoons of generosity. 1 spoon of you, 1 spoon of me, 1 spoon of they and them, 1 spoon of such a beautiful space, and 1 spoon of refugees, 2 tablespoons of asylum seekers, 3 tablespoons of work permit holders, and a couple of spoons of from Gaza, Afghanistan, South Sudan, North Sudan. All these ingredients, I found all these ingredients so beautiful. And that is why we have such a safe community, such a safe space right now, talking about refugees and asylum seekers. As Dina mentioned, my name is Milad Rajabi. I'm a refugee advocate. And my story started when I became a refugee myself in 2021, after the collapse. And since then, I started advocating a lot and completed my forced migration at the University of Oxford, and currently doing my social justice and human rights at the Arizona State University. And at the same time, glad to be sitting here. Jonathan is also from Cambridge Community Society. I'm very involved working with Cambridge Community Society and also co-founder of Refugee Talk, a very new registered charity in Canada, working and uplifting refugees' voice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about Refugee Talks during our conversation with Milad. So we're going to start with Lynn. And as Lynn mentioned, as I mentioned before, part of what this part of the conversation is going to focus on a bit more is the private sponsorship of refugees program. Many of you are familiar with it, but sometimes in these conversations it does get confusing. Which program are we talking about? And I know that sometimes those of us in the space forget that some of the terms we use or things aren't always as familiar to people. So we want to make sure you have time for questions. But we'll just say again that the Private Sponsorship of Refugees program is an official Canadian government program started in 1978, 1979 that allows Canadians, permanent residents or citizens, to sponsor refugees from overseas. So in most cases, the Canadians provide all financial and settlement support for those they are sponsoring for their first year in Canada. Now, in the current state of the program, typically the sponsors know who they're sponsoring. So they approach a group like the one that I work with and they say, we know about this person or family overseas, we'd like to sponsor them. However, there is also a program in which they do not need to know and they simply come and they say, we want to sponsor refugees but we don't know any, and then they can sponsor from a pre-approved government list. So there's more nuances within it, but that's the basic picture. And so that's part of what Lynn's chapter talks about is this program. And so that's part of what we are going to be speaking about for the next few questions. So again, Lynn's chapter in the book, which she co-wrote, emphasizes the urgent need for meaningful refugee inclusion in policy and program development. And it emphasizes that this is currently lacking. And some people hear policy, program development, too abstract, but we're talking about policies that, like the ones I spoke about, have very real impacts for people on the ground, for refugees, for sponsors. So the importance of centering voices of people with lived experience is a central theme of the whole book and Lynn's chapter. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what this looks like ethically to center voices of lived experience and why it's so crucial for policy making to be deeply informed by these voices. Because what we find, what some of you might recognize, is there's a very fine line between having policies informed by lived experience and following the lead of voices of lived experience when we're thinking about justice, versus on the other side, just tokenizing their stories and asking them to do the work. So those are two different things. And we would like to do the first one, not the second one. So how do we navigate this well?
Thank you. Yes, and just to preface that, saying apologies in advance for anyone reading our chapter, that it is very technical because it is such a complex program and the nuances matter. They do have those real effects for people's lives on the ground. So just before I answer it, I do want to position myself in this work. Who am I to be talking about, the meaningful inclusion of lived experience? So just to say that though there is history of forced migration in my family lineage, as there is for so many people globally, I don't have lived experience of displacement. In fact, as many of us know, with a Canadian passport, we can have extraordinary privilege of mobility. So I think largely that privilege is a call to enact justice and equity more broadly. And in the context of the policy making, I can of course frame the ethical argument, but also really thinking about pragmatically, if lived experience does not inform policy, it will not be effective policy, right? That experience needs to be translated through on the ground. And I do need to say, so at the SAW Association, we worked closely with IRCC, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. That's the federal ministry that's responsible for sponsorship in Canada, among many other things. And there are a lot of staff with lived experience, and there are a lot of staff, regardless of their experience, who are genuinely passionate about solving these issues. And in the current context, which Dina framed, not a rosy picture these days. If you'll forgive me for the analogy, it reminds me of when George W. Bush was in power in the US, and we thought that was bad. And we had no idea what was coming. And that was largely the case when we wrote this chapter in 2022, 2023, that we were working with government to really make the program better. And pushing on that, knowing that it was a really positive program. Canada was a leader globally in the resettlement space, in the refugee advocacy space, because of the private sponsorship of refugee program. But we had no idea what was coming down the line, right? Like now the whole conversation has shifted entirely. But regardless, or maybe perhaps even more now, that centering the lived experience in the policymaking is so critical. Inclusion of voices who have been impacted and know because often it's unintended consequences. I'll get into that a little bit more when we get into some more of the details, but it's not always possible for policymakers to see what the end effect will be on the ground versus people coming with lived experience who can say, actually, this is how that played out. So it's ethically important and pragmatically important, I'll say.
Thank you. And I realize I just kind of switched the order of the questions unintentionally, because I was going to ask Milad that question later. But I wonder, Milad, if you would like to answer it now, or if you'd prefer to wait, and then we'll go back to the other questions for Lynn.
Yeah, I can go for the question. Thank you so much for the insights. From my standpoint, I was thinking that ethical inclusion means that people with lived experience are just should not be invited, but it should be part of the shaping decisions from the beginning, from the moment they enter to the country. And it has three factors, I was thinking. Shared power, shared support, and shared dignity in storytelling. When I say shared power, I'm not talking about the power that we think about it. But what I mean is a safe space. When I was a refugee, when I came to this country, I should know I should be included in decision making. I should be in the shared space where people are making decision or people are talking about me. I was just, before the session, I was talking to Dina about the events that are happening, and most of the refugees are not being part of it or not included. And the reason is because refugees are not aware about these events. Today I met some conservative teams at the legislation's office at Victoria, and yesterday I met some NDP ministers. And my focus was refugees they're keen to be part of the events and programs. They're very keen to be part of it, but they don't have the safe space for it. From the far away, they're kind of scared. If I go to that event, am I safe? Oh, that person has more high quality education or high fancy suits, or can I be part of that? So the important part is that we should create a safe space for them so that refugees can come in that room and make better ways in that. Yeah.
Thank you. A phrase that some of you might have heard is nothing about us without us, but it is, we don't always implement it well at all, actually, and it's a continual learning experience, I think, especially when we think about trying to change negative government policy, because some of my initial reaction when I think about it, not what you've said, but when I think about it is I think, but I don't want to put the responsibility of changing bad policy onto refugees themselves. But very often, you know, Milad, like you're saying, but people are saying, but why not? Like, of course, don't put it all on me, but invite me into the conversation, right? We can do this together. It doesn't have to be only non-refugees or only refugees. There's so many more spaces for collaboration than we kind of create sometimes. Yeah, thank you. So Lynn, back to the private sponsorship program. So part of what your chapter talks about, especially because of the time that you wrote it, is something called the Program Integrity Framework, or the PIF. You don't need to remember that term. It's a term we know too well, unfortunately. This was a new framework introduced by the government, new regulations for the private sponsorship of refugees program. Some of you at the event today felt it. You might not have known that we were calling it the PIF, for the Program Integrity Framework, but you felt it because you were suddenly getting emails from your sponsorship agreement holders saying, now you have to meet regulation XYZ that you didn't have to meet before, or you have to go through process ABC that you didn't have to go through last time you tried to sponsor somebody. Peter, you've done lots of paperwork with us. You saw the paperwork, like the amount of paperwork rise exponentially in the last few years, right? Part of that was because of this PIF. So you talk a bit about the PIF. Now, the government said this framework was developed partially to ensure adequate support for privately sponsored refugees once they land in Canada. And certainly I can see that some of the regulations did meet that goal. Unfortunately, at times, the government took a very top-down approach that prioritized surveillance and scrutiny rather than a framework deeply responsive or deeply informed by refugees and sponsors. So can you briefly explain a bit more about this framework and what the impact of the top-down approach has been on refugees?
Thank you. Yeah, it's such an important question because that was the critical piece, was that it was rolled out without consultation with people with lived experience or with sponsors. And so while it was put in place to help protect sponsored newcomers, it ended up really creating inequity in terms of who could sponsor. An example I'll give, it really served to professionalize the program, which maybe on the surface sounds like not a bad thing, but then you lose that grassroots community level support. But so the example I'll give, a really concrete example, there was an Ethiopian sponsorship group, a SAW, as I was saying, a sponsorship agreement holder, whose internal facing documents were in Amharic. And now, all of a sudden, they had to be providing these documents to IRCC, the federal government. So before they could even get to that step, they had to pay to have them translated. Versus, you know, say an English-speaking SAW that didn't have that extra step. So all of these little sort of pieces of bureaucracy that just added more and more and more barriers to organizations and individuals wanting to participate in sponsorship. Another really critical example was that because of the risk management approach, let's say, that the PIF, the Program Integrity Framework, introduced, sponsorship agreements holders needed to ask for the sponsorship funds way more upfront in advance than they would have previously in most cases. So that meant for sponsors, especially, you know, imagine someone fairly newly arrived who has family members still in precarious circumstances. The first thing when they land is, I need to sponsor my family. So they're working to save up that money. It's not a small amount of money. And then it has to go to the SAW years in advance of the family actually arriving. So all of that capital tied up when people are already in vulnerable financial circumstances, right? So there were a lot of on-the-ground pieces like that, like really concrete ways that it just made sponsorship harder, made it less accessible, particularly for family-linked sponsorships, which are really a key piece of the whole program, and something really unique to Canada's program, that refugees can be named So people can sponsor family members directly. A lot of other countries have adopted programs based on Canada's program, but without that naming component. So it's only a sponsor the stranger model, and it loses that family reunification component that's so critical. Yeah, so it was an example, unfortunately, of like a good policy intent that didn't pan out that way on the ground because of not having the inclusion of lived experience in a meaningful way.
So that's one of the changes that your chapter discusses, and it also discusses a number of other changes that have happened with the program in the last few years. Do you want to share anything more about some of those shifts and some of the challenges resulting from them? It's okay. Well, then we'll say, so your chapter concludes with some policy recommendations. And those recommendations are meant to ensure that equity, accessibility, and sustainability are fundamental elements of the private sponsorship program. So equity, accessibility, sustainability. Can you tell us more about these policy recommendations, including why those three elements are so important and how people like us could advocate for them?
Thank you. Yeah, I love this question. I really love digging into the policy side of it all, actually. And, the equity piece I mentioned, a big piece of that was about who could sponsor. There's also who can be sponsored, which is sort of another conversation, but it was about how to allow... Oh, I'm very sorry, that is my alarm, and it will keep going off if I don't make it stop. Sorry, it's on silent for the ringer, but the alarms still go off. And we're back. Yes, and then I lost my train of thought, but anyways. Yeah, so equity for who can access sponsorship. That, again, that family reunification piece that's so critical. When we do sponsor the stranger, which of course is also important, but then every arrival is a rupture of family, right? The very next step is family reunification, and that is such a key piece of the puzzle for people who are separated from loved ones, of course, and for Canadian communities from an integration point of view, right? If we can have families settling together, everyone wins through that. So it's such a critical piece of the puzzle. In terms of sustainability, it's around pieces like funding and bureaucracy and needing the funds up front. I'll not get into too technical of the weeds there, but I think what's so critical in this conversation and what excites me is that often we think government is like out there as this thing, this entity, but really as civil society we do have a lot of power, as was mentioned earlier, partly in terms of political will and what politicians think we want, but also many, many leverage points and ways that civil society can engage. Government represents us and our needs as voters in particular, but also, you know, more broadly residents as well. So in terms of what we can do, I would say, you know, because we're at an academic institution, I'll say research to deepen the understanding of core dynamics like naming. There's not a lot of research that highlights that important distinction of how critical it is that naming is possible in the program, that family reunification piece. And because that changes the whole sponsorship dynamic. It makes it a proxy family reunification program. And that's really underrepresented. And the other critical issue with that being underrepresented is that there is this dominant picture often of sponsors as like white, Canadian, educated citizens, and so on. But the majority of sponsorship and the heavy lifting is often family members or people with lived experience or part of the diaspora community more broadly. So yeah, so I think that's a critical piece of the puzzle. The other thing that we highlight in the chapter is redefining what success of the program looks like. So it's not just that government lens. It's what does this look like for resettled newcomers themselves? What could this look like for communities? So really taking that step back. And what is so interesting with the program is that it sits at an unusual intersection between what I'll call public goodwill. There's not a lot of programs, right, where citizens get to participate in a process like this in a real way, and international commitments and administrative capacity and immigration targets and all the technical pieces. So it's at this really, really interesting juncture. So I would say that, again, there are multiple leverage points where civil society can get involved. The biggest pressure point right now, and therefore leverage point, is the pause in intake. So you can talk to your MP, MLAs, it's not as direct because it's a federally regulated program, but so talking about backlogs, talking about processing constraints, those are key pieces of the puzzle. Yeah, and I'll have to keep myself reined in because I do love, like, if anybody wants to like strategize with me after about how we can, really lean in on these things, I'm all for that. Same online as well. But what I'll say is that we can't just say expand the program, expand the program, expand the program. We will never keep up with the demand. It is a sad fact of the state of the world right now. There's not ever going to be enough spaces for how much displacement there is. Globally, out of everyone displaced, resettlement represents, I think, 1% or something. It's outrageous. And that's the total resettlement, all government-assisted and privately sponsored refugees. So it's not, yes, we want to expand the number of spaces, but that's not our advocacy point to push on, right? We need to be more strategic, more tactical, more targeted, and look for alignment with things like budget cycles or political will, capitalize on those moments when they emerge. And like we were talking about earlier, it's not just at the political level. In fact, I would say mostly not at the political level. It's staff who have been there for decades through various political iterations that actually have a lot of power. Unless we're trying to change legislation, which in this case is not necessary. This is bureaucratic, not legislative, the particular issues and challenges that we're grappling with. So it's actually at that policymaker level, which I find hopeful, right? That's a leverage point that we can access. We just need to push on it and with unified voices, that coalition building, support and amplify voices of people with lived experience, and we'll see what this next iteration will be.
Thank you. To your last point, I mean, currently there are about 42 million recognized refugees in the world. And the United Nations estimates that each year, for the last couple of years, about 2.5 or 2.6 million of them approximately are in immediate need of resettlement, meaning there is not another possibility. It's very clear that the only possible option for them would be resettlement to a country like Canada. But worldwide, for example, 2 years ago, which is kind of the latest stat we have, only 186,000 of that 2.5 million received resettlement. And I'm not talking about Canada, I'm talking about in the entire world. So I think that gets to your point both about that we need to be really strategic and wise about our advocacy, but it also gets to, when people say Canada's letting in too many refugees, I would suggest we need to think of it differently about that kind of number. So the other thing I was thinking when you said you love policy, sometimes we hear politics, and we think, oh, it's abstract, it's bureaucrats and politicians. But I kept thinking of, there's a Palestinian writer named Mourid Barhoudi, and he has this really great section that he writes about, and he says, politics is the family at breakfast. And he says it's who's there and who's not, and why they're there and why they're not. It's how did the plates sitting there get there? Who picked the tea that is in your teapot? And were they paid enough? You know, politics is the nitty gritty of your everyday. And so I think it is important for us to be engaged in this conversation. So thank you. So Milad, now I have some questions for you. And then we have one more for both of you. So across the world and throughout recent history, we've seen that governments often rely on dehumanization in order to advance policies that cut immigration and are unwelcoming to refugee newcomers. That even just includes the very terms they use to refer to newcomers. So it becomes then even more important to have spaces and opportunities to hear from people with lived refugee experience. However, and this kind of gets to our first question that we already talked about, but some newcomers have said that they felt quite exploited in these spaces. So they're invited in, but they don't really have a seat at the table. So they just say, actually, you just made the problem worse. Now, you host a podcast, as we've talked about. So it's a charity called Refugee Talks, but it started as a podcast. So you can all go away from here and Google the Refugee Talks podcast and hear Milad and his interviews. And that podcast was specifically designed for refugees to share in a way that, and this is quoting you, it's a way to uplift refugee voices and create spaces for refugees and newcomers to share their stories with dignity and purpose. Can you tell us more about how you do this?
Thank you very much. Again, what a safe space. I'm talking about the charity, or I usually call it, that's funny, I call it my baby. And the reason is because it has started from my own pain. I remember when I was a refugee in Turkey, I saw the racism in the air. I felt like people breathing the racism. And then when they were breathing, I could see it, actually. And then there was so much pain, there was so much struggle for refugees that I could not see it anymore. First, I recorded my own video and said, I want to make a video and say why that video was designed for, especially for the president that made the country collapse. And then I said, why did you do this? In that video, I cried because somebody was being a racist to me, and I recorded that video and said, why did this happen? And then after that video, that motivated me to sit in a room and invite someone else also to talk about my story. And that is when the Refugee Talk started. There was no nonprofit, there was nothing. We started making a couple of podcasts, and why is this happening? Why people are not being nice with you? And then people started sharing their stories and all. And then after that, I had the idea to make it as a nonprofit. When I went to the government, I wanted to make a nonprofit so that I could open the office and start teaching kids English conversations. They said, no, you're a refugee, you cannot. Because you have to be a protected refugee. I was a refugee claimant. From there, I did not give up. I opened a small space without registration in a very scary place where there was only 1-2 families was living upstairs, and then my room was downstairs. And then I started inviting refugees that did not have documentation to go to school. In that room, I started recording podcasts with these refugees. I started working with them with their new journey. In that room, you could see lots of voices, lots of resilience that they wanted to go to school. And if you go to the website or our Instagram or Spotify, you would see their stories. Most of them are in Persian, but it has a subtitle. But the whole point of refugees, as Dana mentioned, is it's uplifting refugees' voices. And it started from my own pain. And whenever I invited a refugee to share their story, they welcomely came and shared their story because they saw how much struggle and how much motivation at the same time it was in those podcasts. It wasn't just a pain, but it was a lot of resilience in that. And the reason is because now if you see a lot of refugees, they share their stories, but those stories, they seem to be sad, but it has a lot of resilience and challenging stories is in there. And I see a lot of advocacy in that. Because of these podcasts, a lot of people have an idea what refugee faces. Has anyone heard how they cross border from Iran to Turkey? How they claim those, how they run, or how they claim those walls? Have you seen or heard any stories when they cross from Brazil to the state? We have recorded each voices in the refugee talk. Or how they cross the border from Turkey to Greece. I have a podcast. He talked in Farsi, but I translated in English. When he was talking, I could not understand. He faced so much struggle with his family. And it's not easy. The government treats them so bad when they're crossing. Or when they're crossing with the water. And there was a quote actually I heard that those people, they find safety on boat than the land. There was a quote actually I forgot on the top of my head right now. They prefer that over the land. It means they badly want to cross. They badly want to seek safety. That's why Refugee Talk is there. That's why Refugee Talk is for voices and for refugees. And another point is that Refugee Talk is also thinking about to start a resettlement process, but due to funding issues, we're not able to get huge fundings. We do get small fundings for making podcasts and all, but we have never got huge funding to make a resettlement process. And if we, down the road, if we make a resettlement process at Refugee Talk, I promise in this room that refugees will get perfect or better resettlement process. And the reason is because I know I have been a refugee and I know how to deal with them. Even right now, working with Kenbrace Community Society, I know their pain. When I sit with them, I sit like them, I eat like them so that they feel that I'm there for them. Not necessarily saying that other people does not know, but it's a pain that I've experienced, and it's a different pain. When I said that I saw the racism in the air, so it's a different feeling. And I'm writing my book. It's going to be published by the end of 2026. And in that book, I wrote, most of the chapters are about words are hard to describe. I cannot express the pain or that racism in the air with words. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think you're doing a great job putting into words right now, so thank you. And actually, my next question is a little bit about your work with Kenbrace, broadly speaking. So we mentioned you work with Kenbrace. Many of you know it. It's in East Vancouver, and it works to provide support and housing for refugee claimants. But a big thing that Kenbrace talks about in its vision is belonging. Belonging for refugee claimants who come through its doors. So I wonder if you could speak from your experience, your personal experience, but also your work, about what belonging has meant for you as someone who's a newcomer, and what it looks like for you now as you walk with newcomers. And you kind of just said a little bit of it, but if you could expand on that a bit.
Words cannot describe Kenbrace, because Kenbrace is such a beautiful organization, not because Jonathan is there. I work closely with refugee claimants and asylum seekers at Kenbrace Community Society, and belonging is one of the important part of Kenbrace. And the reason is because Kenbrace has has 5 core values. It's welcome, belonging, mutual transformation, prayers, and I forgot 1 or 2. Which I hope it's not inappropriate. And the reason, because belonging is so important, because Kenbrace values refugee claimants a lot. It's a community where people sits together and eats together and share the same value. And one of the most important things we have at Canberra's Community Society is community dinners. And I have understood one thing that makes it very special about Canberra's is belonging in a safe space. If I was someone who go to Canberra's for community dinner or as a refugee who lives there, it's not about the housing or the food or the people who are refugee claimant like me, but it's not about that. It's about the safe space that people are creating. It's about that safe space that Lauren, Alex, Amanda, or other staff that are creating. And it's so special, and I have realized that when someone is sitting in a community dinner all by themselves and no one is there to talk and everyone is busy, and that individual gets a company quickly. And the reason is, that's why belonging is different, or safe space is different at Canberra's.
Thank you. So before I ask my last question to you, and then we have one for both of you, I just want to say that I've had some negative, maybe that's not the right word. I've been talking a lot about our government making cuts. So I want to just acknowledge that we have many wonderful people who work in our government. We have had the chance to interact with a lot of them. A lot of them are working very hard. They are also stuck in certain systems. So I do want to name that because I've been the one talking a lot about the cuts. But I'm also saying that because so they are, yes, all of our politicians and policymakers are human beings as well. But my last question for you then is if our Minister of Immigration, so the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, if she was in the room today, what would you want to say to her in terms of your vision for what a renewed Canadian welcome could look like from a policy and human rights perspective?
Thank you, Dana. I wrote something for the Minister of Immigration. I was following a couple of their videos on Instagram a couple of days ago, and the best answer for that would be, a real welcome is not measured by how many people arrive, but by how they're treated once they arrive or once they're here. And it's not because before the session we were talking about, it's not about how many people are here or how many people are on hold. It's about how you're giving services. And look at the amount of resettlement process, how low is that? Or how many people their cases are on hold in Pakistan? How many Afghans are still being deported, meanwhile their cases are in Pakistan, Tajikistan, and even Turkey? Myself, I waited for 2.5 years to get here. And my message would be this, that welcome is not just by opening the door, it's making sure people feel belong once they enter. There's so many ways that the IRCC can help. Increase English classes, increase wellness sessions for refugees, because these refugees, they don't know how to react when they enter Canada. And my thesis is about the culture shock of refugees that I'm doing, actually. It's starting this month. When they enter Canada, they go through a lot of different phases. The weather is different. When they touch the water for the very first time, they think of something else. They see someone else with a suit, they think of something else. Oh, should I wear that clothes or not? Oh, I have to learn English. So all these culture shocks, IRCC should think different and increase more English classes, more wellness sessions for them, and more care for them. And one of the most important things is they should create spaces that refugees go and learn how to do advocacies, or how to walk with Canadians in the same way. Because as I mentioned before, whenever I go to events, I see one refugee. Among all these advocates that I went to at the legislation office at Victoria, I was the only refugee. We were 20 plus people. And there are millions of refugees in this country. And I want them to learn. And that safe space can be created by IRCC from the beginning when they enter. From the beginning, IRCC can create programs and say, you should do this, you should do that. And also organizationally it should develop. That's why I said Refugee Talk, this podcast, we do a lot of advocacy. We tell to folks, go do this, apply this. Go for your masters. If you do work during the day, go for English classes in the evenings. Advocacy is really important. And I have one important thing actually to say at the end, is that advocacy starts from here today. We have 20 people possibly. 20 people are going home now today, will teach 10 people, each of us. And that 10 people, we promise that 10 people should teach other 10 people. By the end of the month, by the end of 2026, we will be advocating 10,000 people, roughly. And those advocacies should be around immigration, IRCC's cuts, that it should stop. Yeah.
Thank you, Milad. That's a good segue into my last question for both of you. Before we open it up to any of you or anyone on the online who has questions. So one of the current narratives that our government has been amplifying, I'm not saying they started it, but we're hearing it a little bit from them still, is that in order to justify some of these cuts that I talked about, that you've mentioned as well, is a narrative of scarcity. So that there is not enough, that there's not enough housing, that there's not enough healthcare, etc. So one of the unfortunate, perhaps unintended consequences of that is then that newcomers are sometimes scapegoated for decades of bad housing policy, for underinvestment in healthcare. So the narrative becomes it's their fault. So they're blamed for problems that they are not the root cause of. So they're participating in a system of lack of housing, but they didn't cause it in the first place, but they're being blamed for it now. So in the middle of this, how do you think we can be voices of hope? And what different narrative, what kind of renewed vision can we amplify?
I'll give Milad the last word, so I'll jump in. Yeah, it's such an important question, and I think one point to highlight is that there are other good examples. Yes, Canada has a feather in its cap with the private sponsorship of refugees program, but there are other nations. I'll just share anecdotally one example. This is not, from research. This is just from a colleague, but a Canadian who immigrated to South Korea and literally within days had a doctor and full access to healthcare, had access to Korean lessons, had, there are other models that Canada can draw on. I think because of our neighbor, we maybe thought we were even more welcoming than in fact we have been. So I think there's a lot of potential there. And did I answer both parts of your question? No. Can you just do a quick?
What different narratives are looking at?
Yeah, and how can we shift that? Yeah, it's a challenging time to shift any public narratives right now, and I think individuals are feeling that sense of scarcity more than in past eras, right? Everyone's worried economically and worried about the affordability crisis that we're in, frankly. I loved your kinship word, like that was such a beautiful word, and I think in times of challenge, we need that spirit of kinship even more. How we influence that in the narrative, podcasts are great, there's lots of great vehicles for doing that, but I think it is having conversations like this, and I don't know, this maybe I don't know if this is substantive enough, but I would say leading by example, right? If we do the work, I myself have had the privilege of being a repeat sponsor, and I think, you know, if we keep showing up in the world in the ways that we want to enact, then the story does shift. It's a long trajectory, but it does make a difference, right? It's each, the story is made up of all of those threads combined.
Thank you so much. A great question. I wrote something here, is scarcity is not created by people seeking safety like refugees, but is created by the system that fails to plan justice. And it's happening. It's very obvious. Whatever happens, it's not only Canada actually. Wherever you go, something happens, immigrants did it, refugees did it, or you did it. If they don't find refugees, you did it. That's what the human nature is actually. And then we misunderstand this. And that's why advocacy should be taking place. That's why I said it starts from this room. And we are so much powerful, friends. The voices are so much powerful that crosses the borders. That is why I believe in refugee talk like my baby. It crosses the borders. It reaches to the people and say, refugees are here to build future. Otherwise, they didn't want it to leave their home country. A couple of days ago in another discussion I mentioned, I did not come here to see beautiful downtown Vancouver. I did not come here to see big Ferraris, expensive cars, big hotels, or have a fancy suit, or have a car, expensive car, or whatever. I have come here to live because there was a war in my country. And because of the 1951 convention, everyone has the right to move or seek refuge if their home is not safe. And most of the countries signed for that, like Canada. So I don't want to go over the topic. The refugees are not taking anyone's job or anyone's opportunity. If someone who wants to find opportunity or job, they can find it themselves. They should knock the doors. The opportunities does not come to you. A couple of days ago, I was telling to someone, as a refugee, I'm going to knock everyone's door and I'm going to go and get that opportunity because I have that mentality. If you were born here, if you lived in this country for years and years, if you do the same as me, you would do the same. You can do that. I got the scholarship in forced migration, you can do that. Apply for it. If you want to get a job, go apply. Print 50 resume, go downtown and start distributing it. Are you doing that? No. So it takes, you need to move. You need to move yourself to get a job or get an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Milad. Thank you, Lynn. The Canadian Council for Refugees, some of you know it, has a current campaign called We're Better Together. CPJ has signed on to this campaign. World Renew has signed on to this campaign. Others have signed on, and that's really what the message is. We're better together. We're better when we have all of our voices. We're better when we're living and speaking out of kinship with one another. And that's how we move forward as a Canada that is stronger because of our many different voices and perspectives. So thank you so much for being part of that. And I'd like to ask if anyone in the room has a question. And Rena, if you're seeing any questions in the chat, you can speak them as well. Yes, one question in the room. Can you speak into the mic just so the online people can hear you?
Hi, I have a question. It's Lynn, right? For Lynn, you mentioned visiting our MPs to talk about this C-12, but also the other legislation. They're not the bureaucrats. Our MP, for example, is brand new to the job. And I have spoken to an MP before on another matter and kind of opened her eyes about something she didn't even realize. But if it's the bureaucrats we should be talking to, and we're out here in Vancouver and they're in Ottawa, how do we make these changes? And also the fact that C-12 has passed. I don't want to be discouraging, but it feels discouraging on these important things. And I think our news media has fed us this line that Canada doesn't want more immigration, it doesn't want more refugees. It'd be nice to know where to get the truth from, but also what we can do with MPs.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. It's, yeah, as I say, it is unique timing, right? And I think if I may go back to, I think, my very first remark about the ethics, but also the pragmatism, I think we need, in this moment, pragmatically, to maintain a stance of hope, so that we do keep advancing. If we let ourselves get discouraged in this moment, then things will just cascade from there. I think MPs can be a good leverage point. As I say, I think at the staff level is actually where we have more power often, but that doesn't mean that MPs don't still have a role to play. For example, in even passing along a letter or something to the appropriate bureaucrat. Like I was fortunate in my position with the SAW Association that we had what was called the NGO Government Working Group. So almost every week, I think, we had meetings with civil society and government. So there are avenues like that where there's a direct pathway, but I think just in terms of general civil society, going through the MP is not a bad process, even if it is, like you say, the other way around, where you're actually helping educate them about the issues, but then they carry that back with them to Ottawa. And if you ever are in Ottawa, go visit your MP while they're there. They love when constituents visit them, and it changes the tone of the whole conversation. But there are avenues as well. Like you can search online for who, but I would say, going through your MP doesn't hurt. Just that the political level is not the only, like when people think about advocacy, they often think only the political level. And that's something that changes, every 4 years, and where people might not be educated in the issues versus the bureaucrat that's worked in that same ministry for 10 years and maybe feels passionately about it, right? And that's why they're there in the first place too. So, but yeah, I think all the leverage points have value.
If I can add to that just quickly too, is that I think all politicians and policymakers would acknowledge they're not fortune tellers. And what I mean is they cannot predict every single impact of every single policy that they make. And even this morning I was on a call with many people and the IRCC, Immigration Canada, and part of what our section of our presentation was called View from the Front Lines. So what are we seeing as actual impacts on the ground of policies or lack of policies? And they were there to listen, actually. And I say that just because your voices as people who are sponsors or who are newcomers actually do matter, because MPs have said it is helpful for us to hear real stories, because we can bring that back to the House of Commons and say, hey, maybe we didn't know that this would be the ramification of that policy, but I want to tell you what I'm hearing from my constituents about what's actually happening. So don't underestimate that piece as well. But at the same time, we don't put all our eggs in the basket of government advocacy, but I think it's important. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Lillian and I'm a clinical counselor, crisis line supervisor, a refugee myself, and I do a lot of work with advocacy, with refugees, a lot of people vulnerable in the community. And what stood up for me is the talk about creating safe space. And I kept reflecting on my work, the real people I see, people who are in survival mode a lot of time, unable to think about maybe like more advanced things like mental health, belonging a lot of times. It's more stuck at the basic needs level. And it kept me thinking, how can we bring more motivation, not only for refugees, but us people in the community to really participate in creating that safe space? Thank you.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for that comment. Milad or Lynn, would you like to comment?
Thank you so much. That's why I said this room is complete. When I say complete is, as you said, we're better together, the campaign. Someone from a refugee background, someone from a different background, when we're all together, that's when the community becomes better. That's when nobody will start complaining or saying that jobs are less because of some communities or minorities. Safe space and mental health sessions needs to be more supported. That's why I brought up IRCC should focus more on English classes, wellness sessions, events or workshops that talks about the culture shocks. What happens or what will happen to you coming to Canada? Before they send them, they can kind of give them workshops in Turkey, Pakistan, kind of to make them ready what they will face, because these changes or these culture shocks will put them into a lot of depression, stress, and even sometimes, I don't know if you saw the news, that some of the people, they went into using drugs because of the depression and stress or the culture shock. They can't just accept a new culture because they did not educate, they did not go to school, and most of the Afghans from Afghanistan, they did not go to proper education, so they don't have understanding of new cultures. So it's better to work on more new strategies. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Getting a new microphone.
Oh, thank you so much. This kind of follows your question a little bit, but I'm not a refugee, I'm an immigrant. I came to Canada 8 years ago, and I'm half Korean, half Indian. I wanted to speak a little bit to your scapegoating comment because that's so real. And a little bit about the cross-cultural element. I wonder what resources are currently available for the open dialogue of cross-cultural education and awareness between Canada and the people that we're welcoming. So a real example of that is, I'm half Indian, half Korean, and I get comments from like people here or people elsewhere that there's a lot of too many Indians, they don't understand the culture here, they treat it like it's India and all that jazz. And I understand that, and I understand the intersectionality of it. It's nothing is black and white. And if you come from a monoculture and you don't understand different cultures, of course you're gonna see things in a specific light and way. From personal experience, I grew up a chunk of my life in Korea and India. So in India, I grew up in a way that physical distance, it's okay to be super tight because it's an overpopulated country. So people are like really, really close to each other. But in Canada, you guys have a lot more land, so people can enjoy their physical distance, right? So that's a very small cross-cultural difference that people don't register in your brain because that's normal, that's what you grew up with. And little examples like that, I wonder if there is education or resource around that for newcomers. Yeah.
Well, my response might be a bit challenging, where, I mean, yes, absolutely, we want to set people up for success in their new home. But I think I would challenge us to think differently about, or at least to think in terms of both sides of intercultural fluency, I'll say, where there doesn't have to be a way that it looks to be in Canada. And so maybe it's also Yeah, just that we can all be more interculturally fluent, I guess I would say, where, different communication styles or different proximity or different ways of being, and that we all benefit from that. But I think there are, like, a lot of settlement agencies do provide programming to help when people arrive to know more about the milieu that they find themselves in. Yeah, did you want to add?
Yeah. If there's a time, sorry. I'm just going to keep it short. Thank you so much. It's really important, and I always say, we're beautiful together. If I speak Farsi, you speak English, if you speak Hindi and Korean, how beautiful is that? How beautiful is that I'm short, you're tall, you're wearing blue, I'm wearing green? How beautiful is that your eyes are green and my eyes are blue? How beautiful is that somebody shakes hands and somebody hugs? And we are the one who created this mentality of saying, no, I like my culture and I do not like your culture. And if you actually see from a wide perspective, every culture has been created from somehow, and it's really important for themselves, and we have to respect it. Now, coming back to the main question about if there are any resources. Yes, you might find less resources like neighborhood houses. Neighborhood houses actually has events and programs that actually brings different people, and they have dancing workshop, dancing classes, or they have wellness sessions. And I found that neighborhood houses are as good a space for people to understand each other's culture. Because the rest of the organizations are it's not like they don't want to have that sessions, it's just because they're too busy and they don't have enough funding for that. If IRCC or the ministries actually, Ministry of Family and Children actually, if they should take initiatives to do that, because for those kids actually, they have to learn about their culture. Before they learn about Canadian culture, they have to learn about their culture because they're living with their mom and dad. And it's really important, and that's what these immigrants or refugee families, they're expecting. They want their kids to learn their first language as their mother tongue. And it's beautiful. They have to learn that. They have to learn how to use what is it called that Koreans actually use? They don't use spoon, they use what? Chopsticks. How beautiful is that, right? I still don't know how to use that actually, right? And if I learn that, I see it as a beautiful thing that I learned this culture today. I want to see it that way. So there should be more fundings for the rest of organizations like neighborhood houses to put more events to bring different cultures and say, let's learn from one another.
Yeah, I was going to say that more spaces where we can come together, and neighborhood houses over dancing or over food or other things. I lived in Egypt for a time, and some of my closest Egyptian friends, who I learned the most about Egyptian culture from, were people that I met playing ultimate frisbee. So not, from intentional program or curriculum. We played frisbee every week, and then we go eat food. And while eating food, I could finally say, okay, there's this thing about Egyptian culture that I do not understand, and it's driving me nuts. And I don't know who I can ask about this that I won't offend. But I just played frisbee with you for the 5th week in a row. I can ask you this question, and then they could say to me too. Many of them said, "We've never been to North America. Most of what we know from Canadian or American culture is from TV shows, but we've been really dying to ask this thing. Like, is that inaccurate?" And they're like, "We didn't have anyone we felt safe to ask." So sometimes that's where we get the most, cultural understanding is through actually closing that space between us, right? Yeah. So thanks so much. I'm not seeing anything online from Rena. So I just thank you again for being here. And we're about out of time. So I'm going to let Tim, though, close us off.
Thanks, Lynn Millad, for your participation and your wisdom that you shared tonight. We were going to take some time to talk about our responses, but we've hit 9 o'clock, and so I want to honor the time. I just want to leave us with a word Millad gave us. You, by being here tonight, know more about the issues of refugees and immigrants than most people in Canada. And so we do have a responsibility to talk to other people about what we've learned and heard tonight. And that's my encouragement for all of us, is to speak with a few people about what we've heard and learned tonight, so that we're sharing this story, the stories that we're hearing tonight. For those of you who are part of faith communities, some of us here, including myself, help lead a group called a Network of Churches Welcoming Refugees. And we sponsor events like this and try to keep the conversation going. And if you are here tonight and you registered with Rena, maybe just send an email and say that back to her, say, yeah, I'd like to be part of this network and get the information about it. And she can pass that on to me, because we'd love to keep you informed about other events like this where you can continue the conversation. I want to thank everybody in the room for coming here tonight. We didn't know how many we'd have in the room, and it was nice to see you all here in the room. And I want to thank all those of you online for participating. I know it's sometimes harder to participate online in the evening, and we really value you participating with us here. So go in peace. Bye.